We will now begin the first session, The United States and the International Order, chaired by Ricardo Alexandre from RTP.
Muito bom dia a todos. Umas pequenas palavras curtas palavras em português. Gostaria de agradecer o convite do Instituto de Defesa Nacional e do Sr. General Vítor Viana para moderar este debate. É sempre um prazer voltar a esta casa, ainda para mais quando a iniciativa é conjunta com duas outras instituições que muito prezo, no caso a FLAD, Fundação Luso-Americana para o Desenvolvimento, e o Instituto Português de Relações Internacionais. I was given instructions to conduct this session in English, so I will start by introducing the panel. Vasco Rato, PhD in Political Science from Georgetown University, where he teaches international relations. Is a researcher of the Portuguese Institute of International Relations, advisor at this institution, the National Defense Institute, and since January 2014, president of the Luso-American Development Foundation. Carlos Gaspar, on my left, is a PhD in International Relations from Universidade Nova here in Lisbon, a former advisor to Presidents Ramalhianos, Mário Soares and Jorge Sampaio, advisor at this Institute of National Defense, senior researcher of the Portuguese Institute of International Relations, member of the European Council on Foreign Relations and the Portuguese Association of Political Science, and author of several books, such as O Pós-Guerra Fria and A Balança da Europa. And our guest from the United States, on my right, Tarun Chabra, is a fellow with the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. Previously, he served on the National Security Council staff as a Director for Strategic Planning and Director for Human Rights and National Security Issues. He also contributed to policy processes related to U.S. security assistance, autonomous weapons systems, detention and interrogation, and simultaneous intelligence reform. Before this, he worked at the Pentagon as a speechwriter to Secretaries of Defense Chuck Hagel and Ash Carter. He has also served as a consultant advisor to the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and worked at the United Nations in the Executive Office of UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. As I told you, the session will be in English, but when we come to the Q&A period, the audience is free to ask in Portuguese, and I will try to translate to the best of my ability. Tarun, I'll start with you. Welcome to IDN. My first question or my first challenge to you would be to let us know about your views over two fundamental documents that were recently released, the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy. What do they tell us about Trump's administration foreign policy? Are those documents clear guidances on the administration priorities? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you to our hosts. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak with all of you, and I look forward especially to the questions. I'll just say I think that as many of us were waiting for both of these documents to come out, the big framing question was, to what degree would President Trump vindicate some of the promises that he made during the 2016 campaign, which basically I think many would call a quote-unquote Fortress America approach, a neo-isolationist approach to American foreign policy, versus, on the other hand, a recalibrated engagement with the world. I think that was the key question. And I think that both documents suggest, as well as some other facts on the ground, that he's really moved significantly to the latter. So let's start with the national security strategy. I think, as has been mentioned, the core idea in this national security strategy is that We are seeing the reemergence of strategic competition between the United States and its peer or near-peer competitors, Russia and particularly China. And it makes the claim that the United States was essentially on a strategic holiday after the Cold War until recently. And that's a claim that you could dispute or not, but it's certainly one. It's a strong claim that's made in that document. A second point is that it says that America's alliances are a source of strength for the United States, which runs very contrary to what President Trump said on the campaign trail. And third, even though the document is very critical about the United States' trade relationships with the world and multilateral trade arrangements, on multilateralism more broadly, and particularly with the United Nations, it's actually a lot less strident, and I would argue, than the Bush administration's first term in particular. You don't see the views of someone like Ambassador John Bolton reflected in that document. If anything, it says that the United States can find ways to extract advantage from working with partners in the UN system. And then going to the National Defense Strategy, it largely, I think, contains those key elements without some of the protectionist language related to trade in the National Security Strategy, and without some of the harsh language on migration and immigration that's contained in the National Security Strategy. So it underscores this key theme of strategic competition, but it also notably says that counterterrorism should come second, which is not clearly stated in the National Security Strategy, but is in the Pentagon's document. It says that the United States should be, quote, strategically predictable but operationally unpredictable. And which to my mind is something of a stunning rebuke to the president, right, who has said many things that I think argue that would suggest the United States might be strategically unpredictable. So that was a remarkable statement, I think, in the Pentagon's document. The third is it argues that the Pentagon should focus on its capability rather than capacity. And I know that's a very bureaucratic-sounding term, but what it basically means is the United States should emphasize the high-end capability of its military to address threats from Russia and China, even if that comes at the expense of the size of its overall armed forces. And finally, I would just say something quite remarkable, apologies, is that the Pentagon's document refers to the international order 14 times, and 14 times in an 11-page summary of its strategy, because the overall strategy is classified and not public. The National Security Strategy issued by the White House never refers to that term once in almost 60 pages. It certainly refers to the post-war order, and there's some slipping and sliding here and there, but that's a very striking difference. So, yes, there are challenges in both documents to the status quo in terms of American foreign policy and the international order. I mentioned trade and immigration on the National Security Strategy. Trump's speech was remarkably at odds with the strategy itself. And on the National Defense Strategy, there's very little mention of North Korea, even though in many cases the White House seems to be threatening war, a preventive strike on North Korea. And last, it's unclear whether the White House has a plan to pay for it all and whether the Congress will pay for it all. To date, we still don't know what the defense budget will be for the current fiscal year.
600 billions?
Well, it's still to be determined, right? Somewhere between 600 and 700 billion. The administration has argued that it needs something closer to the higher end of that, but we still don't know what the actual defense budget will be, and that all comes against the backdrop of a lot of domestic uncertainty, which is something that we could talk about.
You refer the expression international order being mentioned 14 times in those 11 pages of the summary. But you also mentioned in the beginning the electoral campaign slogan, America First. Is it still just a slogan or already a coherent doctrine?
I think the question has always been, going back to the original point about the framing here is, does America first mean Fortress America, or does America first mean recalibrating our foreign policy, but not a radical departure? And again, I think that it's more of the latter. And interestingly, I think you're going to see, particularly in the upcoming presidential campaign, many candidates on both parties endorsing some of the general approaches that I think are embraced in both of these documents, and we can discuss that in a moment. What the reactions have been like across the political spectrum in the United States.
Very well, thank you very much, Carlos Gaspar. Would you say that the most important, we are talking about the U.S. and the international order, would you say that the most important challenges to U.S. foreign policy at the moment are the biggest competitors, let's say, a more assertive Russia and China trying to play a more and more influential role in international politics?
Obrigado. The documents that Taron was referring to are innovative in the sense that they clearly state that strategic competition between major powers is now at the center of American security concerns. This is very clear, and it's totally new. The national security strategy documents in the past, including the 2015 Obama document, always referred to terrorism, rogue states, climate change as the main security concerns of the United States. Now, both documents, both the White House document and the Department of Defense document, state clearly that it's all about great power competition. Great power competition is back. And it's back in the form of Russia and China. And Russia and China are dealt with in a rather rough language. They are treated as twin revisionist powers. There is an exercise going on to understand which is really the most important foe to the United States. Taron said that it's China rather than Russia, and there was a Chinese analyst who made the exercise of counting how many times China and Russia were referred to in the national security strategy, and it's 33 times China and 25 times Russia, and 11 times both Russia and China, and the order is China and Russia. But the national defense strategy redresses this balance, and in the summary of the national defense strategy, what is written is that China may be the threat in the long term, the main threat in the long term, but that in the near term, Russia, with its diplomatic, political, and strategic capabilities, and its capacity to run risks and conduct military interventions in its near abroad, is in fact the main foe. And we are still waiting for two other documents. We are waiting for the cybersecurity strategy and the nuclear posture review, which I think will be the most important one, as it addresses the core issue of U.S. national defense. And again, it's been long since this nuclear issue has been put to the forefront, as it is in the national defense strategy. The national defense strategy says that renewing, modernizing the United States nuclear deterrent is a key priority. This is consistent with competition with Russia and China, the twin revisionist powers. But as far as we know, there is a leaked document on the nuclear posture in the nuclear posture review, Russia is the main threat, and clearly so, because China is very much a second-rate nuclear power. The National Defense Strategy recognizes that China is making a huge effort in investing in its armed forces, but it's rather conventional armed forces than new weapons rather than nuclear weapons. So we have a new definition of the United States strategy, which is written under the aegis of principled realism. I don't know what principled realism is. We all know what realism is. Of course, all the national security strategies of the United States from way back have been realist strategies, but it is the first time that the White House feels the need to stress that this is a realist strategy.
To reinforce that
However,
idea?
principled, but still a realist. We don't know what that means.
I'd like to get your opinion, Vashkat, on this, but trying to relate it to something on the agenda today, U.S. has decided to release a list of 116 Russian politicians and 96 oligarchs, a kind of who is who of those who flourished with Vladimir Putin. This list, the release of this list, somehow being fulfilling a demand by the Congress, but at the same time, the White House, at least for now, has decided not to punish anybody under new sanctions due to the alleged 2016 meddling in U.S. elections. Yesterday, in an interview on my station RTP, NATO Secretary General justified the international sanctions against Russia with the rising tensions because of the Russian interference in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. Vasco, would you say that we are increasingly coming to a no turning back road leading to confrontation with Russia?
I wouldn't say we're coming to the road. I said we've been on that road for a few years now, and not just since the Ukraine, but actually since Georgia, since the intervention in South Ossetia. Maybe I could go back here and say something about an earlier comment when you spoke of America first. I think you have to understand Trump on various levels. I think largely through newspapers we understand Trump on the level that journalists and his opposition wants us to understand him, which is not necessarily the level he's at.
On the level of the tweet or of the soundbite?
Yeah, but don't take the tweets too seriously either, because the affirmation Trump speaks of America first, I don't find at all shocking. I mean, I would find it shocking if the President of the United States said American third or fourth or 23rd, as I would find shocking if Mrs. Merkel said, Germany in seventh. So I don't think that this is the correct way of putting the question. I think Tarun stated it clearly. Can the United States become a fortress to America? And the answer is no. And I don't think Trump ever actually said that. Trump is actually, in some ways, not very different than Barack Obama or Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. He's a declinist. He thinks that the United States is in decline. And the idea of Make America Great Again was, how do you avert that decline? And the answer is not through isolationism. The answer is through a new type of engagement. And I think we're beginning to see this very clearly. He's not necessarily an isolationist on trade either, because what he opposed was unfair trade. He thinks that a lot of these trade deals were unfair. And some of them, in fact, were, specifically with regards to China. And so what you're seeing is a recalibration, and I think from here on forth, you're going to see a lot of continuity in American foreign policy. So I wouldn't dramatize too much some of the styles, some of the things that are said. Now, in regards to Russia specifically, again, I think he's right, but Hillary Clinton also thought that Russia was a strategic competitor. I mean, so there's no terrific difference between the two candidates on the question of Russia. The problem is how to deal with Russia, and what I think is clear is the kind of restart that the previous administration attempted to do, that failed. And that failed largely because that's not what the Russians want. So we focus a lot on what the Americans are saying about Russia. It's perhaps time to focus a little on what the Russians are saying about the West. And the Russians have chosen the West as a strategic competitor, and it's not recent. It, again, from my point of view, it dates back to the military invasion of Georgia.
Tarun, how does this discussion about the priorities of the national security strategy and the defense strategy fit into the debate, at least theoretically, inside within the foreign policy circles between the so-called traditionalists and the so-called nationalists?
Yep, great. And I actually have a slide on this point, so if we could pull that up, I think that would be good. I can show you. But while that's coming up, I'll just say I agree with a lot of what Vasco said about the continuity. I mean, it's worth pointing out that if you look at many of the key policies that the National Defense Strategy is advancing, many of them actually are traced to the second term of the Obama administration, and mainly Bob Work, who's the Deputy Defense Secretary at the time, and have argued that strategic competition really will define American foreign policy over the next decade, and that we had fallen behind in terms of sustaining our military advantage vis-a-vis Russia and China. And so, in fact, the person who had the pen on the National Defense Strategy was a longtime colleague of Bob Work at a Washington think tank. So there is a lot of continuity in that regard. And I would just add, though, I think there's now a debate, and this is a debate that will be had in the run-up to 2020, which is how resilient is American public support for its posture in the world? And I think it's an open question. So on the one hand, if you look at a lot of polling, you actually see pretty consistent support for America's alliances, even for globalization and a fairly open trade posture. But if you ask the question slightly a different way, which is generally something along the lines of, should America mind its own business more, or something like that, then the results are more concerning for internationalists. And I would just say, what does it mean when we say that, where does the narrative of declinism come from, right? I think there's some hard numbers that are useful to keep in the back of your mind. So the first one I would mention is work by the economist David Autor at MIT and many of his colleagues. Some of you might be familiar with it, but the conclusion is that between China's accession to the WTO in 1999 and 2011, 2 million American jobs were lost, attributable to China's accession to the WTO. So that's point one. Yeah.
2 million.
Sorry, 2 million. Yeah, 2 million. And point two would be the opioid crisis that's going on, which to many analysts is connected to job loss and the stagnation of the white working class in the United States, particularly those without a college degree. We're seeing for the first time a decrease in life expectancy for white males under 50 if you have no college degree, while if you have a college degree, your life expectancy continues to go up. So that sharp divergence in morbidity and mortality. Inequality in the United States today looks like it did in the 1920s, which is exacerbated further by an urban-rural divide. So these are all background factors that I think have to be accounted for. And in the meantime, too often I think the foreign policy establishment's answer is to the problem of defense spending is We simply need to deal with what we call entitlements or what's called the welfare state. And I think that's a recipe for disaster. It means that we will lose the American consensus for internationalism. And so ultimately we have to pay for all of this in some terms. And foreign policy analysts are very reluctant to talk about domestic policy. But this ultimately will come down to a domestic debate about taxation and redistribution in the United States. Uncomfortable territory for foreign policy analysts that they didn't have to get into for a long period of American growth where we were growing between 3 and 5% a year. So that's a background that I think you have to keep in the back of your minds. It's not simply a Trumpian narrative conjured out of thin air, but there are real numbers and statistics behind it. So just to your question, though, about how the reception of the national security strategy in picture, this is a little bit of a cartoon. Many people don't like where they've been placed here. But what it basically shows you is, on one axis, the x-axis, it's how have people responded to the national security strategy itself, of the document. So on the left side, it's a negative reaction. On the right side, it's a positive reaction. But the point of this is to say that you also have to then chart reactions to Trump himself. So some of the things that Trump has said, particularly on the campaign trail. And so what that means is in this quadrant 1 here, on the right, basically you have a lot of Trump supporters, right? You have Fox News at the far end, at the right, but then you have a number of more conservative Republican foreign policy advisors who traditionally might have supported a more mainstream Republican foreign policy, but have increasingly been supportive of the president, mainly on the grounds that his talk about burden sharing with allies deserves more attention. If you go down one, you'll find the more traditional Republican foreign policy establishment there, with a few Democrats as well, who believe that this theme of strategic competition was underemphasized by the Obama administration and really deserved more attention. And then if you go to the bottom here, you'll see more traditional Democratic foreign policy types, largely negative both on the strategy itself, also on Trump. But what's interesting here is that if you go to the top left here, people who don't particularly like the national security strategy, but were more positive about Trump, is the only people really there are the academic realists, the folks who have argued that the United States has been too deeply engaged in the world, overcommitting itself, and liked some of the things that Trump said on the campaign trail about pulling back. And they're disappointed by the national security strategy because to them it's a mainstream document and he's been conquered by his foreign policy advisors and the establishment. But you don't see actually many other people in this frame. You don't have many of the people who oppose the president's decision to maintain troops in Afghanistan, for example. They've been remarkably silent. So maybe they're happy just about what he said about trade and they've been satisfied on other counts. But this is a very lonely place right now. And so that for internationalists should bode well for the moment.
On the other hand, Carlos, some of the critics of the current administration say that the national security strategy abdicates from U.S. leadership in support of universal values. Would you say that the American leadership regarding universal values such as human rights and freedom of expression and so on are at stake?
Yes and no, in the sense that the pundits in Washington wonder if President Trump has read the national security strategy, which he signed. So we don't really know what his opinion is. His instincts seem to be that democracy promotion overall is bad news and something that should be in the past, and that U.S. strategies should very much concentrate on trade, on the economic dimension, and also on the military dimension. And basically, human rights, democracy promotion are not on President Trump's agenda. He never mentioned it. He's clearly a reactionary rather than a conservative. And I think that it is important to make that distinction. He wants to recreate a new type of great power relationships, to coin a word, and this is very much into the national security strategy. However, again, in the national security strategy and also in the national defense strategy, which are a kind of third way between the liberal internationalists and neo-isolationists, if they really exist, of Fortress America. What the text says is that China and Russia are revisionist powers. This is a very strong position. It's a very strong word. And the documents explain what it means. It means that Russia and China are challenging not only American interests and values, but they are also challenging the free and open order, international order, that sustains American values and interests in international relations, and that they want to change it. They want to change this American international order with a repressive order. And through this word, repressive, not authoritarian, but repressive order, the issue of regime differentiation comes back into official U.S. Strategy. We are again dealing with an opposition between the United States and the democratic alliances on the one hand, against the repressive order fostered by the revisionist powers, China and Russia, and of course also the minor ones, North Korea and Iran and stuff. But basically, this recreates, as far as the documents are concerned, we don't know what President Trump really thinks about what his national security strategy should be, but as far as the documents come, they define a conservative, realist position, stressing the cleavage between the United States and its democratic allies on the one hand, and the repressive powers, revisionist powers on the other hand.
Tarun, let me move on with a small provocation. Analysts say that more and more the U.S. foreign policy is conceived and carried out at the White House. So one could ask if the State Department still exists.
Just very quickly, so it's an important question, but very quickly, to Carlos' point, I think there's some ambiguity in both of these documents about what exactly the nature of the strategic competition with Russia and China look like, and by that I mean there is reference to a repressive order, but you can read it two ways. One way to read it is what each country is looking for is quite simply a sphere of influence in their neighborhood, right? A regional hegemony in which they can coerce, co-opt, force their way, bribe their way, right, into dominance of their region. And we're already seeing that, obviously, and that intention is quite clear. The question is whether, in addition to that, either or both powers feel it is necessary to install, support autocratic regimes in order to maintain that, or simply for its own sake. And I think on that question, the jury is still out to some degree. I mean, we have increasingly in Washington a concern about Chinese influence operations, a good report out by the National Endowment for Democracy about Chinese efforts in Latin America and Europe to undermine free press and criticism of China. So I think that question, though, is critical because it goes to the issue of, in terms of democracy promotion, democracy support. Is that a core strategic concern of the United States? Or is it something else? Is it a second-tier issue as it's been treated, I think, for a while? So that's an open question that I think has to be treated. In terms of the State Department, I think you've asked it the right way because Tillerson, I think rightly, has been criticized pretty roundly for his State Department reform efforts. You know, we're a year now into the administration. There are scores of appointments that have not been made because we're still waiting for the reform proposal to be completed here. But it goes to a deeper problem, I think, in terms of the relationship between the National Security Council, the White House, and the State Department on the other hand, and the State Department trying to find its purpose when White Houses have been increasingly assertive in the making and even implementation in some cases of U.S. foreign policy. And that's a bit of a crisis that I think, you know, as we've talked about before, dates to Henry Kissinger and Nixon's distrust of the State Department, and it's still an unresolved question. You know, I think if you had seen a Clinton administration, you certainly would not have had the headlines like you have today about the State Department, but I think you probably would have seen some of her most trusted advisors put into the National Security Council and not at the State Department, and a similar kind of tension. So I think there's some good initiative on Capitol Hill right now to look at deeper reform of the State Department, particularly at a time, you know, when resources are really channeled to the Defense Department and they are taking a greater role in foreign policy making. But this is a question much deeper than just Tillerson's own views.
Vasco, would you add anything on this? Would the press behave differently if there was a Hillary Clinton administration?
Of course. I mean, it does behave differently. All you have to do is hear and see one of the press briefings at the White House, or just tune in CNN any day of the week, Anderson Cooper, to know that there is no objective coverage of this administration. It's become a political football. I mean, things are as they are, but I don't think in the United States today you have much of an objective press. I mean, you don't see it on Fox, but you also don't see it on CNBC. You don't see it on CNN. Some of the newspapers are actually better now, I think, New York Times, Washington Post. But on the whole, I think the press reflects what's been happening in the American civil society over the last 20 years, and it's an increasing polarization and quite an uncivil discourse. And so politics becomes very hard. And I think that...
Was the electoral campaign in 2016 the starting point of that trend, or
No, it was a reflection of that trend. I mean, we saw it in some of the criticisms of Obama. We certainly saw it. We tend to forget, but we certainly saw it how George W. Bush was treated when he was president, and now he seems like a moderate. That's not what was said at the time. So I think it's very, very important to distinguish between things that are actually said and things that are transmitted to the population by way of the press and by way also of social media. I mean, so I think this is a tremendous problem. In fact, I'm not alone in thinking this. I mean, George Soros has said this. A number of people have said this at Davos last week, that this has become an increasing problem. So part of the difficulty I have with Trump is that he also does that. I mean, he does it through Twitter, but it's not very useful for us to understand politically what's going on. And politically what's going on, the United States is trying to react to a changed international situation. I mean, it is a fact that China is ascending. I mean, we see it in the construction of islands in the South China Sea. We see in the way it deals with its neighbors. We see it now in the type of relationship it has with Pakistan and the construction of Godwin Port and the private army, basically, about 10,000 people to guarantee that port. I mean, we do see it all over the place in the Indo-Pacific region. And so I don't think it's very, very useful to look at Trump and as a bull in a china shop, although he may be, but that really isn't the point. The point is, what is the United States doing in order to address the new realities of international power. And so it is a return to a realism. And when we talk about democracy promotion, again, I'm not sure he's saying that there will not be democracy promotion. He's saying that there will not be military interventions to promote democracy. He's saying that there will be no democracy promotion if by democracy promotion you mean reproductive rights, women's rights, and that sort of thing. He's clearly saying no to that, but he's not saying that there is no democracy promotion. So I think a lot of distinctions have to be made here because partially I think the language is new and the posture is new. We're not used to a president of the United States like Trump. But again, and as Tarun said, there are reasons that explain why he won. And he did win, because it's not, the ambassador is no longer here, but I don't think it's fair to say, well, he won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. Well, that's true, but he had to win the Electoral College. If he had to win the electoral vote, the electoral strategy would have been different. He didn't go to California. There was no use in going to California. And legitimacy is derived from who wins the vote. And this is another problem. Over the last year, you've seen numerous attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the president and to try to impeach him. I think this is part of the reality of American politics today, but it's very difficult to exercise international leadership if your institutions are under this kind of crisis, and they are under this kind of crisis in the United States.
Would you comment on this, Carlos?
Obviously, it's very difficult to have a leadership role, and it is indispensable for the international order that the United States is committed, is engaged in the forefront of the numerous international crises. It's difficult to do that when, on the one hand, you have a very inexperienced president who has, I think, no experience of international relations or diplomacy at all, or did not have when he took office. And on the other hand, when you have such a degree of internal divisions, you must reconstruct some kind of consensus in American foreign policy. And the Brookings graphic tells us that we are still far from reconstructing this consensus, although I think that this third way, which is defined by the national security strategy, and especially by the national defense strategy, goes some way towards rebuilding this kind of bipartisan and also political consensus on foreign policy. I think this has been very clear, although it's not entirely reproduced in the graphic. It has been clear in the fact that some of the stronger critics of the Trump administration foreign policies, from Tom Wright to Cory Shaka, have had something positive, rather positive to say, about both the NSS and the national defense strategy. So it's going to take a while, but so far these documents move us into the right direction. Although again, and I've been reading the Chinese press on Trump, so the Chinese say that President Trump changed his position on China because of his advisors. And they have a point. They have a point. It's
how's that? How's that?
Because the outlook of Chinese analysts on the first years of the Trump presidency is rather positive and not negative. There was a very strong cooperation between Washington and Beijing, between President Trump and President Xi Jinping on North Korea. The Chinese analysts have this fixation with quantitative elements, and they say they met 3 times face to face. They were on the phone 9 times, and they wrote 6 letters to each other, which is much more than Obama did. But this is a criteria, I mean, somewhat formal criteria, but it stresses the fact that in Beijing, the foreign policy analysts, which very much reflect official positions, say that the first year and the dealings on the North Korean crisis overall were positive in Sino-American relations, and that the aides are ruining it with these documents. These documents, from the standpoint of China, being treated as a revisionist power, are extremely negative and are a step backwards. And if they have a point, if it is the aides that define, shape foreign policy, we have a problem, because it's not the aides who are exercising power, it is the President of the United States that exercises power on foreign relations at the end of the day.
Taron, this, even bearing in mind this evolution of the relation between the U.S. and China, this leads me to reflect on the distinction between these two strategic competitors' relationship from the U.S. side, meaning that one story is Russia, but China, besides being a competitor, must be as well looked as a partner, isn't it?
So I think look, so the Russia-China question and how you distinguish between the two in the strategies, I think in the national security strategy, the White House document, can be attributable to the fact, so they combine them mostly, and I think that's probably because that was going to be more palatable for the president himself. So I think the president was going to be less likely to accept a strategy which differentiated the two, because then it would force the strategy to discuss how Russia poses a threat in a public document. And, you know, I don't know to what degree they wanted to really test that proposition. So the easiest thing for them to do was to combine them and then let the Pentagon document differentiate between the two, and particularly the classified document. So that's on one. But I think more generally, it's important to point out there was a pretty active debate within the Pentagon during the Obama administration about whether it is Russia or whether it is China that poses the greater threat. And that really informed, you know, the question of the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific. It informed what kind of initiatives we should be engaged in Europe. The nuclear posture review, because these questions, you know, came up from a funding perspective during the Obama administration, which basically said it would support the renewal of our nuclear arsenal. So, you know, I think we went from a period in which most of our uniformed senior military leadership believed it was Russia, now to a posture in which that consensus has shifted toward China. Over the course of not very long, probably over 4 years,
but regarding China, there's as well as an economic dependence.
Right, and so that's where, and that is where, you know, what is the balance between cooperation and confrontation, right, with China? And that I see as the main fault line within, particularly the Democratic Party and foreign policy advisors of the Democratic Party. I mean, if you look up here at the bottom between the left and right quadrants, that's really what this division is about, between people like Tom Wright here on quadrant 4 and many colleagues on the left. And if you here I'm actually missing a lot of China experts in the United States, because they didn't weigh in necessarily on the national security strategy, but almost all of them would be in the bottom right quadrant supporting the national security strategy's general narrative about China. And there's a very pronounced generational difference as well that's remarkable among many U.S. sinologists, I think, of an older generation who believe that cooperation is still possible on many accounts, and that we really are putting ourselves at risk of greater confrontation than necessary. And that is not the belief of younger China scholars who spent time there more recently. And so that's really the big debate that I think is going to be unfolding. And you could ask the question, even if the Trump administration believed, right, that China is the main strategic competitor, it has been amassing advantage at a rate that's not been appreciated. Is it wise to emphasize that in a public document? That's a fair question to ask, right? And I think some of them
It's
have
a
thought
question
about
of
that.
strategic predictability.
Yeah, that's right. That's
You have
right.
to choose whether you are strategic predictable
Right.
or not.
I think
And that is the issue.
they wanted to send that message to allies in Asia and in Europe as well, I think to some degree. And B, I think they believe there's a domestic mobilization component to it. I think that their view is that we won't have support for the defense budget necessarily to deal with this challenge unless the rhetoric is shifted dramatically. So I think both of those really informed the way that they talked about China. And will there be downsides? Probably, yes. It probably will mean at certain moments that when there are opportunities for cooperation, it'll be made harder. But I think many in the administration have actually weighed this, and they've come to this conclusion.
A while ago, Carlos mentioned the two documents that are still about to be released, the cybersecurity strategy and the nuclear policy review. What do you think that will come out of those documents?
Yeah. So on the nuclear posture review, you actually have, I think, a pretty solid bipartisan consensus of it's a narrow slice. It's nuclear experts within the foreign policy community who I think will largely support elements of it. And the key question really for this review was to what degree the United States would embrace the development of nuclear weapons are essentially at a tactical level to respond to changes in Russian nuclear doctrine. And I think if you take seriously, if you buy into this driving narrative of growing competition with both countries, and Russia in this case really is the key question, the ability of Russia to so-called escalate to de-escalate is a real challenge that I don't think that we had an answer to unless we looked hard at that question. And it's very hard for many people who worked in the Obama administration who, arguably would embrace this narrative, worked in the Defense Department, but on the other hand, also embraced elements of President Obama's overall approach to nuclear weapons, which was the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons one day. This certainly takes us backwards from that perspective, but I don't think it's compatible to, on the one hand, embrace this world of growing strategic rivalry, but on the other hand, not to adopt some of these measures in the nuclear posture review.
Secretary Mattis said that, referring to US obviously, our competitive advantage has eroded in every domain of warfare. We have spoken about the national security strategy and the defense strategy. Do you think, how much worried should Europe be about this erosion?
If there is erosion, because I would assume there are a number of weapon systems that are classified and we don't know. I mean, we know about the new weapon systems when they're actually used, so there's a lot of stuff we don't know. Now, having said that, Europe should be very worried because if there's one element that President Trump is absolutely unequivocal about is the necessity for Europe to contribute more to defense. This isn't just an obsession by this president. I mean, we've had talk about burden sharing for 40 or 50 years. The point remains that Europe's armed forces continue to be inadequate in every sense, in terms of operationability, in terms of budgets. So this I think has to change. And I think if there's a greater commitment to reducing what the Americans call free riding, I think that the relationship will be much more predictable, clearly. I'm an advocate of greater European defense spending because I believe that the European integration process is unthinkable without NATO. And if Europe doesn't contribute more to NATO, then I think we will have in the future problems with European integration. So that's the first point. The second point is that we're witnessing in Europe a number of parties that have as a common theme in their foreign policy a rejection of NATO, the European Union, and a criticism of the United States. This is the National Front in France, a lot of the radical right-wing parties, as well as the radical left-wing parties. Some of these people are actually winning elections. I mean, the president of the Czech Republic fits in this category. This is being used by Russia, I think, to create divisions within Europe, and a strategic ambition of Russia today is the same as it was during the Soviet period, to divide Europe and to divide NATO. And so these are the realities we have to deal with. Now, Tarun mentioned something that's very important, I think, that we're seeing this tension build up in the eastern flank of NATO. And the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, these countries sense this, and these countries are aware of it. So it's very interesting to see what's happening in these countries where defense budgets are going up. Service Militar Obligatorio is being reintroduced in a number of places. They're thinking about it in Germany. They're beginning to discuss it in Germany. And a lot of this is due to what is seen as an aggressive posture on the Russian part. And part of that aggressive posture are the nuclear weapons that are being placed in Kaliningrad, as well as this doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. This means transit permuj. This means using nuclear weapons on the field. And there are tremendous security implications to this. I think that we in Europe have to look at Russia in a different form. I think that Trump is right about Russia in one sense. I think in the long term, it is useful to have a partnership with Russia because the threat of recalibration from China is greater. So I think the Americans and the Russians have to come...
Keep the door open.
No, it's basically what Nixon did with China in relation to the Soviet Union. I think the Americans are going to have to reach some kind of understanding with Russia at some point. Whether it's possible to do it with Putin or not, or Putinism beyond Putin, I doubt it, because if you look at what Putin says, if you look at the security documents coming out of Russia, it's actually the Russians that don't want that kind of relationship.
Carlos, speaking about Russia and the way Russia is dealing with defense and strategic issues, we have as well the ongoing Turkish offensive in northern Syria against Kurdish forces. If it comes to a point when the Turkish operation goes until this Majib area, and if there is any kind of direct confrontation with U.S. troops that are effectively on the ground there, would you say that we are in a situation where the alliance itself is at stake? Because, as we know, U.S. and Turkey are the two biggest armies, if I may say, at NATO.
I don't think it will come to that. And the NATO southern flank has had numerous problems, namely between Turkey and Greece in the past. Of course, it's always difficult when two allies are on the opposite sides in a local war. But this happened in Yugoslavia for quite a few years. So it's of course a crisis within NATO, but it's not, I think, the end of NATO. But I think that it also interferes in the triangular balance that we have been talking about: the United States, Russia, and China. How to manage it? Should Russia be recognized as the main foe? Should China, in the long run, be recognized as the principal challenger to the United States predominance, all those kinds of things. But we should try to look at it from a broader perspective. This was also the dilemma of British foreign policy back in the 30s. Which of the revisionist powers, the twin revisionist powers, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, was the main threat? And the British foreign policy was wrong on its calculations, and this led to a war. And we are, I think, in very much the same situation as we speak.
Would you agree on this, Tarun, Vasco?
On the Turkey question, or you?
Yeah, the Turkish question in general, the way the situation we face now.
Yeah. So, and I hesitate to step on the toes of the next panel because you have, I think, some real Turkey expertise in the next panel, which I'm not. But I was working, directly the day of the attempted coup in Turkey with the National Security Advisor, and I was the Deputy National Security Advisor that evening because the National Security Advisor was away, and I remember very vividly how it all unfolded, and I remember also that the next morning our very, very skillful ambassador John Bass sent an email to the White House, kind of suggesting what the implications were going to be for U.S.-Turkish relations and for NATO over the next few years of this event. Remarkable analysis and insight for someone who had been all night dodging gunfire through the streets. But everything that he said really spoke to long-standing issues in the relationship and the direction of the regime, which simply were accelerated and exacerbated by what happened there. And so I'm not very optimistic. I think our best case scenario is muddling through for the moment and trying to ensure that we don't have incidents like this.
Vasco, even if we are talking about a strategic alliance and the defense alliance, is it compatible to get? They are there, of course, but is it compatible to get together in the long run countries with such diverse approaches regarding fundamental issues?
Are we talking about Turkey or?
Turkey and the Western democracy.
I don't know. I mean, that kind of question, I don't think anybody knows. We don't have a crystal ball. I would say two things. First, about Turkey. Turkey's problems with the Kurds is actually a Turkish problem. It results from the way that the Turks conceptualize the state and the nation. I think the only way out is what is proposed by some parties in Turkey and broadly on the left, actually, in Turkey, which is some kind of an autonomous solution for the Kurds. That is not acceptable to Erdogan, and the more secularist elements also don't accept that. So in the short term, I don't see a way out. I think that if Turkey resolves its own Kurdish problem, then the relationship with the autonomous Kurds in Syria, but also in Iraq, is also possible. And this doesn't necessarily imply a Kurdistan, a Kurdish state, but it does imply a rather different relationship with actors such as the PKK. And I would recall to you that the leader of the PKK, who is in jail, actually took the initiative to talk with Erdogan a few years ago, and it was the regime that broke those. So I think it's possible, but I think Tarun is right. In a short term, you have to muddle along. if it's possible for the allies to get along together and with their disagreements, yes, of course, that's what we do all the time. My preoccupation is, again, how Europe now looks at Russia and deals with Russia, because different European countries have different dependencies in relation to Russia.
Germany?
Well, not just Germany. I'm thinking specifically about dependency on gas, for example, and countries like Italy have a very different posture than does Poland, for example. So increasingly, those divisions are themselves becoming a problem for Europe, for our self-definition and what we want in political, in foreign policy. So Russia is becoming a problem for us, although it's not necessarily, or you may even not think it's a military problem, but it's becoming a political problem. And a lot of the divisions that we now see in Europe are a result of Russia and Russia's actions. I don't need to remind anybody about the kind of response that Europe had to Ukraine, first to the annexation of Crimea, and now to the war, where these positions are not entirely clear.
Very well. Now it's about time to get some questions from the audience. I just ask you to identify yourselves before the questions you may ask. I think there's a microphone over here.
Good morning. My name is Bernardo Ferreira, and I would like to ask my question to Mr. Vasco Rato. My question begs a bit of supposition and refers to the European and American, or European and NATO security with regard to the previous US election. Such my question is, do you think Europe and NATO would be safer having elected President Trump, with President Trump's worsening relations with Europe? Or do you think Europe and NATO would be safer having elected President Hillary Clinton, given that she would maintain relations with Europe, but possibly worsen relations with Russia, and consequently worsen relations within NATO and Russia? Thank you.
I would say, put that question to me in 3 years' time. We'll know better. But obviously Hillary Clinton gave Europeans a number of guarantees that candidate Trump did not. But it's also true that after having said that the alliance was obsolete, that President Trump was very quick in reinforcing the importance of Article 5. He did this in July of 2017 in Poland, in the speech he gave in Poland. So I think, yes, during the campaign, there were things that were said resulting from inexperience, perhaps. I think the administration as a whole, including President Trump, was very quick to correct that impression. That doesn't mean that there aren't differences between both sides, but I think we can go some way towards working out those differences if Europe understands that Trump is right about burden sharing, that Europeans are going to have. Defense is not free, it's a collective good, it's not free, so I think Europeans are going to have to put up more money for European defense. And I think the United States has to understand that alliances also mean consultation. Even in areas where you decide to give companies an opportunity to repartir their profits without previous consultations with the European allies. I don't think that's acceptable. But it's a learning process, I think, on the whole. Again, I see a lot of continuity in American foreign policy. We just hope both sides can avoid mistakes.
Thank you very much. There's a question from an auditor in Porto. Please.
Good morning. I would like to pose a question to Mr. Tarun Chabra. I read your article, Mapping Reactions to Trump's First National Security Strategy. and at some time you wrote that it is time to update the debate about how and how much the bureaucracy constrains the president. My question is very simple. What is the real freedom of a president like Donald Trump to formulate the national security strategy of a country like the United States of America? Thank you very much.
Question of José Manuel Ribeiro. Yes.
It's a good question. The piece that he's referring to is kind of the accompanying text to this map, and one of the points I may make is that it is striking the degree to which the national security strategy is at odds with things that Trump had said before. I think there is a question about the degree to which Trump was always willing and able, as Vasco referred to earlier, or even intending to moderate many of the things that he had said and to really lay out basically a negotiating posture. Yes, I mean this question goes back to a long-standing debate, in political science literature in the 70s. Richard Neustadt talking about presidential power, or Steve Krasner versus Graham Allison on the one hand. Allison saying it's all about the bureaucracy, and Krasner saying, calling it Alice in Wonderland was the title of his piece. And I think that even Obama found this too. He felt often, I think, very constrained by the national security bureaucracy. What Trump's national defense strategy has said is that counterterrorism efforts should be downgraded as we deal more with strategic competition because they entail different capabilities, was something that Obama was very intent on, was referred to earlier, talked about during the campaign as well, and found it very, very difficult, I think, in many ways to kind of tame the bureaucracy. And so it's a question of choosing your battles.
But regarding the national defense strategy, General Mattis has said that this is his strategy, not a strategy of the bureaucracy at the Pentagon, which is also a signal he tries to send to the Congress, at least.
Exactly. I mean, I think that very much supports the point, which is it is his, and now let's see if he can implement it.
I think we still have time to another question. Sir, on the second row.
Manuel Fernandes, retired ambassador. My question to Mr. Chavra. One issue that was not addressed in this panel, but which has caused divisions between the United States and some Europeans, and among Europeans, is migration. The phenomenon of migration as it is today, and mainly its connection with what some see as the risk of fundamental Islamism. Now, does this still be seen as a foreign risk to American security, or is it just more an economic issue for the Trump administration? In European views, it is also considered a security risk, even more than the economic challenge. What do you think will be the evolution in between these two views? Thank you.
So, I think in general, obviously the way in which migration happens to the United States and the way that it has happened in Europe over the last several years is worlds apart. And the ways in which security threats accompany that migration. And so I think Trump has exploited the security risks that have accompanied migration here to argue that they're just as easily translatable into the American context, which they're not. The vetting that happens for refugees and migration to the United States is intense. I sat through a briefing when the Trump staff was coming in, and we were involved in the transition, and in which we basically relayed to them all of the vetting that happens in this context. And the answer was, the response was shock. I think there was just an assumption that we were letting people in willy-nilly with really no serious background checks for security issues. So I think largely that is a fig leaf. Now, that being said, the reason you have people like Francis Fukuyama or Larry Diamond make an argument that we need to have basically agreeing with Trump that we need to slow down migration is that they're looking historically at migration trends in the United States. And their argument would be that we've not seen migration levels this high for many, many decades. And when we have had similar migrations, and what they look at generally is the number of children born to foreign parents in the United States, that has almost always been accompanied by high levels of xenophobia in the United States. And so their argument is one about sustainability, but I think the security one is really shibboleth.
What do those figures tell us? The migration numbers are we talking essentially of people coming from Europe and the European refugee crisis, let's say, or mostly coming from Central America?
Well, I mean, I think
because it's an issue. It's a political issue.
No. I mean, obviously, most of my migration is from Central America, and I think that what Trump though tried to do is conflate the security risk. I mean, General Flynn, before he left the White House, I think, was on the record kind of making arguments about Hezbollah's infiltration into Central America, and this has been a theme, on the far right. So there's been a deliberate effort to conflate.
It was a great session. Thank you very much to all of you. I'd like to ask you to join me in a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much.